Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into one of the most bizarre, disturbing, and frankly exhausting realities of ancient Mesopotamia: temple prostitution. Yes, it sounds like a strange, almost titillating concept at first, but the reality for those women and, sometimes men, was anything but glamorous. Life in a temple wasn't filled with silk sheets or scented oils. It was a mix of religious duty, social expectation, exploitation, and sheer survival. Temple prostitution, or sacred sexual service, was tied to religious practice, fertility rituals, and economic necessity. In cities like Babylon, Uruk, and Uruk, certain temples were not just places of worship, they were institutions, centers of wealth, and, surprisingly to modern minds, labor markets for the body. Women who entered these temples were often very young, sometimes just past puberty, and came from families who could not afford to feed them otherwise. Others were dedicated at birth, part of a family vow, or even sold into temple service to pay off debts. Imagine being a teenager, taken to a grand temple with towering ziggurats and golden altars, and told that your life from now on would revolve around pleasing strangers in the name of the gods. It wasn't about romance or desire. It was about obligation, survival, and the constant pressure to maintain the favor of both humans and deities. The temples, paradoxically, were places of both protection and entrapment, sheltering the girls from the streets, but binding them into routines that left almost no personal freedom. Daily life was grueling. Temple prostitutes were expected to maintain ritual purity, participate in endless religious ceremonies, and perform sexual services at scheduled times. Records from cuneiform tablets suggest that sex for the gods was highly regulated. There were rules about who could enter, when, and how many times per day a woman could be used in a sacred service. While some might romanticize this as ritual worship, for the women it was monotonous, exhausting, and humiliating work, one that blurred the line between sacred duty and exploitation. The temple itself was often a fortress of contradictions. On one hand, it provided shelter, food, and a degree of social recognition. On the other, it imposed strict hierarchy and discipline. High-ranking priestesses might live in relative comfort and wield authority over newer recruits, while younger or less skilled girls were treated almost as property, their labor traded or allocated according to temple needs. Some temples even maintained internal rosters or schedules, detailing exactly which women would serve which visitors, at what time, and for what purpose. It wasn't all about male visitors either. Fertility rituals sometimes required women to serve other women in ceremonial contexts, creating complex dynamics of control, hierarchy, and religious interpretation. Girls were not merely performing sex, they were being taught that their bodies were instruments of divine will, meant to ensure agricultural fertility, city prosperity, or the favor of powerful gods. This spiritual framing, though comforting in theory, didn't erase the sheer physical and emotional toll. Beyond rituals, life was also about survival. Young women in temples had to navigate relationships with older priestesses, foreign merchants, and even city officials. Wealthy patrons could make life easier or harder, depending on their favor. A single misstep, disobedience, failing ritual standards, or displeasing a powerful visitor could have consequences ranging from public humiliation to outright punishment. In a society where your value was tied to service and compliance, constant vigilance was exhausting. Socially, these women were trapped in a paradox. They were honored as sacred instruments of the gods, yet scorned in everyday society as fallen or morally compromised. Marriage outside the temple was nearly impossible, because men viewed temple women as spiritually bound or already owned by the gods. Family life was often out of reach. Their identity was folded into the temple, their body and labor claimed by the institution, not by themselves. Economically, temples were centers of power. Fees collected from ritual participants, tributes, and offerings funded the city's wealth. Temple prostitutes were a living part of this economy. The more desirable or skilled the woman, the more she contributed to the temple's prestige and revenue. This financial aspect added pressure. Performance was not only a spiritual duty, but a monetized expectation, a daily reminder that your body was currency in both sacred and material terms. Even outside the temple, their reputations followed them. If a girl left the temple, through release, age, or escape, she faced a life of limited options. Society didn't always differentiate between voluntary and sacred service. She could be stigmatized, treated as a common prostitute, or relegated to menial work. Freedom, in Mesopotamia, was never as simple as leaving a job. It was complicated, dangerous, and often unavailable. Over time, some women found ways to navigate the system. Skilled priestesses learned to wield influence, manage schedules, and negotiate favor with visitors. Certain temples allowed older or more experienced women to gain a degree of autonomy, offering mentorship to younger recruits. But these were exceptions, not the rule. Most women spent decades in monotonous, physically demanding, and emotionally taxing roles, framed as sacred duty but experienced as a daily grind. In short, being a temple prostitute in Mesopotamia wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting, exploitative, and deeply controlling. Ritual, hierarchy, religious expectation, and social perception combined to create a life that was physically taxing and socially isolating. The women were both honored and trapped, sacred and exploited, valued and commodified, sometimes all at the same time. Life inside a Mesopotamian temple was a mixture of ritual, labor, and constant surveillance. Once a girl was admitted, the temple became her world. Every movement, every action, and every interaction was observed and regulated. Daily routines were strict: washing, dressing in ceremonial garments, participating in prayers, chanting, and attending to visitors, all choreographed in a way that reinforced the authority of the temple and the gods it served. The physical environment was imposing. Ziggurats rose high into the skyline, and temple walls were decorated with carvings of gods, kings, and mythological scenes. Courtyards bustled with priests, merchants, and worshippers. While the architecture could inspire awe, for the women inside, it was a constant reminder of entrapment. Every corridor, every chamber, was structured to maintain control, minimize escape, and emphasize hierarchy. Even small gestures or lapses could lead to reprimands, and the fear of punishment was a daily psychological burden. Emotional strain was relentless. Girls and young women had to navigate relationships with older priestesses, temple officials, and visiting patrons. Every interaction carried subtle power dynamics. Favor from a priestess could mean a slightly better meal, less grueling work, or temporary respite from the most demanding rituals. Disfavor could result in isolation, public humiliation, or being assigned the hardest duties. Essentially, the temple was both protector and tormentor, a paradoxical environment where survival depended on obedience, cleverness, and resilience. Sacred prostitution was also physically demanding. Ritual encounters could last for hours, and girls were expected to perform with precision, maintaining ritual purity and proper decorum at all times. Any sign of fatigue, illness, or hesitation was noted and could affect future duties. Temple life blurred the boundaries between work and personal identity. The girls were never simply themselves. They were instruments of divine will. The line between devotion and exploitation was consistently crossed. Financial and social pressures compounded the strain. Temples relied heavily on offerings and fees collected from visitors participating in sacred rites. Temple prostitutes were integral to this economy. Their skill, attractiveness, and compliance directly influenced the temple's income. This meant that every act of service had not only spiritual but also economic weight. In a sense, their bodies became a currency, traded not in coins alone but in social, religious, and financial capital. Education and training were part of temple life, though often focused on ritual and performance rather than personal growth. Girls learned to sing, dance, and recite prayers correctly, to handle ceremonial objects, and to navigate complex hierarchies. They were taught the mythologies and religious codes of Mesopotamia, which framed their labor as sacred. Yet, this training did not empower them. It conditioned obedience, created compliance, and reinforced their role as instruments rather than autonomous individuals. Interactions with the outside world were limited and tightly controlled. Visitors were supervised, and temple women had little choice in selecting whom they served or when. Some wealthy visitors might become regular patrons, forming relationships with particular women, but even these connections were heavily constrained by temple regulations. Escape or refusal was rarely an option, and the social stigma outside the temple made integration into broader society difficult if they ever left. Temples also operated within broader political and economic networks. Wealthy merchants, local rulers, and temple administrators influenced daily life. Donations and offerings funded construction, maintenance, and ceremonial festivals. while girls and women carried out duties that directly impacted these resources. Being part of this system meant that every action, every interaction, every act of service had significance far beyond the individual. It affected the wealth and reputation of the temple, the perception of the gods, and the structure of the community. Despite the harsh realities, some women developed strategies to survive. Older or more experienced priestesses learned to navigate the hierarchy, subtly influence decisions, and mentor younger recruits. Small alliances and friendships helped provide support, camaraderie, and occasionally minor freedoms. Yet these were exceptions. Most women spent their entire lives within the temple, enduring repetitive, taxing, and highly controlled routines, with little hope of independence. Psychologically, the impact was profound. Girls grew up in an environment where self-determination was limited, where body and labor were constantly evaluated, and where societal respect was conditional on obedience and performance. The duality of sacredness and exploitation created an identity crisis. They were venerated for their role in religious practice, but devalued in terms of personal autonomy. In short, temple prostitution in Mesopotamia was exhausting, restrictive, and inescapable for most women. They were trapped between divine expectation, social control, and personal survival. While temples provided shelter and a semblance of status, the cost was immense: loss of freedom, autonomy, and often childhood itself. These women were living paradoxes, honored as sacred instruments of the gods, yet exploited in ways that left little room for personal agency. Inside the temple, structure and routine were everything. Every day was meticulously scheduled, leaving little space for spontaneity or personal desire. Morning rituals began before sunrise, often involving ablutions, prayers, and offerings to the gods. Girls and women had to be alert, precise, and visibly reverent at all times. Any lapse, even minor, could draw reprimands from priestesses or temple overseers. The temple was designed to enforce obedience through repetition and ritual, creating an environment where compliance became instinctual. Physical strain was relentless. Temple prostitutes often performed multiple rituals and services per day. Some ceremonies required extended periods of kneeling, chanting, or maintaining particular postures while interacting with worshippers. Others involved sexual rites, which, though framed as sacred, demanded endurance and the suppression of personal discomfort. Exhaustion, both physical and emotional, was a constant companion. Sleep was regulated and often insufficient. Meals were functional rather than comforting, and leisure was nearly non-existent. The body became an instrument of ritual, monitored and measured for performance rather than well-being. The emotional landscape was equally complex. Relationships within the temple could be supportive or competitive. Older priestesses wielded power and influence, and younger women often had to navigate hierarchy carefully to avoid conflict or punishment. Friendships formed, but trust was fragile. The temple was a place where loyalty could be rewarded or exploited, and where favoritism could determine quality of life. Survival required careful observation, subtle negotiation, and the ability to anticipate the whims of both human and divine authorities. Training extended beyond rituals. Girls learned to sing sacred hymns, perform ceremonial dances, and memorize prayers and mythological narratives. Education was not optional. Proficiency ensured survival and sometimes minor privileges. However, the focus was never on personal development. It was on refining skills to serve temple duties and satisfy visitors. Creativity and individuality were suppressed, replaced by conformity and ritual expertise. In essence, every act was evaluated, monitored, and, to some degree, commodified. Visitors played a crucial role in the temple's economy and social hierarchy. Men and women from the city, foreign merchants, and officials came to participate in rituals or seek blessings. Their interactions with temple prostitutes were tightly controlled, but also essential to the temple's financial and spiritual function. A skilled or attractive woman could elevate the temple's prestige and revenue, while mistakes or disinterest could bring consequences. The women were aware that every gesture, every performance, had weight far beyond their personal lives. Ritual purity added another layer of restriction. Women were expected to maintain physical cleanliness, emotional composure, and spiritual alignment. Certain foods, behaviors, or even relationships outside the temple could jeopardize status or privileges. Regular inspections ensured compliance, and minor infractions were met with corrections. ranging from public admonishment to reassignment of duties. The temple enforced a delicate balance of devotion, discipline, and display. Age and experience slightly altered life within the temple. Younger women often faced the harshest routines, while those who had served for years or decades could achieve a degree of autonomy. Senior priestesses might oversee ceremonies, assign schedules, and even mentor newcomers. However, this relative influence did not equate to freedom. The temple's structure remained hierarchical and restrictive. Even high-ranking women were bound by ritual, expectation, and the needs of the institution. Social perceptions outside the temple were often punitive. Women leaving service were rarely free from stigma. They were seen as morally compromised, having spent their lives in sacred sexual service. Marital prospects were limited, and societal reintegration was challenging. Many women returned to families that had little choice but to dedicate them to the temple in the first place, creating a cycle of dependence, expectation, and judgment. Economic pressures shaped daily life profoundly. The temple depended on offerings, fees, and donations, and temple prostitutes were central to this system. Each act of service, each ritual, contributed to the temple's wealth. For the women, this meant their bodies and labor were constantly evaluated in both sacred and material terms. Excellence could bring recognition and small privileges. Failure or fatigue could reduce status, comfort, and access to necessities. Despite the hardships, some women developed resilience and strategy, observing patterns, forming alliances, and learning the intricacies of hierarchy allowed some to gain small advantages. They might receive better sleeping quarters, improved meals, or temporary exemptions from the most grueling duties. Yet these moments of relative relief were temporary. The temple remained a system designed to maintain control, enforce obedience, and prioritize institutional needs over individual well-being. Ultimately, life in a Mesopotamian temple for a prostitute was a continuous balancing act between survival, duty, and the need to maintain composure under constant scrutiny. Sacredness provided structure and status, but at the cost of autonomy, comfort, and personal identity. The women were honored as instruments of the gods, yet exploited as human laborers, existing in a paradox that defined their entire existence. That as the days unfolded inside the temple, the monotony of ritual and service became inescapable. Even small breaks or moments of rest were regimented. Girls woke before sunrise to wash, dress, and participate in early prayers. The ziggurat towers loomed above them, a constant reminder of divine authority, and the temple walls, adorned with carvings of gods and kings, reinforced the hierarchy they were part of. Every detail of the environment was designed to impress worshippers, reinforce obedience, and instill a sense of subtlety, control. Physical labor was unending. Beyond ceremonial duties, women often handled cleaning, preparing altars, tending sacred gardens, and assisting with offerings. These chores, combined with ritual service, left little time for personal care. Even meals were functional, quick, repetitive, and designed to sustain energy rather than pleasure. In addition, temple prostitutes were expected to maintain a certain appearance, at all times hair braided in prescribed ways, garments cleaned and arranged according to ritual standards, and posture perfect. Every visitor judged not only spiritual devotion but also physical presentation, turning the body into a constant performance. Sexual rituals added an additional layer of pressure, while framed as sacred acts to honor fertility gods or ensure city prosperity. They demanded emotional detachment and physical endurance. Girls learned early to separate personal feeling from duty, to obey rituals without complaint, and to manage interactions with strangers in ways that maximized temple favor and avoided punishment. For some, the repetition became a form of numb endurance. For others, it was a source of psychological strain that lingered long after rituals ended. Hierarchy within the temple shaped life profoundly. Senior priestesses wielded authority over younger recruits, assigning duties, regulating schedules, and enforcing ritual standards. This created a network of control and subtle competition. Favor with powerful women could make life slightly easier, providing minor privileges, while disfavor could result in harsh labor assignments or public correction. The system rewarded compliance, cunning, and adaptability, but rarely allowed true autonomy. Survival depended on constant observation and strategic action. Education reinforced obedience. Girls and young women were trained in religious law, ceremonial chants, and sacred dances. Knowledge was a tool of both spiritual significance and social control. Mastery brought small status elevation, but the core purpose remained service. Creativity or personal expression was discouraged. Rituals demanded precision and repetition. Every act was measured against temple standards, ensuring that individuality was subsumed under collective purpose. Interactions with visitors were tightly monitored. Worshippers, merchants, and city officials participated in rituals, sometimes requesting specific services or favoring particular women. While some women learned to navigate these interactions strategically, even the most adept could not escape the scrutiny of the temple hierarchy. Their bodies and actions were constantly evaluated, both for spiritual compliance and contribution to the temple's prestige and wealth. Life outside the temple was largely inaccessible. Freedoms enjoyed by non-temple women, marriage, family, independent work, were often denied. Women who left the temple faced stigma, limited opportunities, and societal suspicion. The paradox was striking. They were honored within the temple as sacred instruments, but devalued in broader society. Reputation, autonomy, and social standing were constrained, reinforcing the temple as both a shelter and a trap. Economic function was central to ritual labor. Temples relied on donations, offerings, and ritual fees to maintain operations and fund community projects. Temple prostitutes were integral to this system. Their participation enhanced the temple's prestige and ensured financial stability. Excellence in performance was rewarded with minor privileges or status recognition, while failure or fatigue could reduce comfort or increase labor. Each act had spiritual, social, and economic weight, intertwining the women's labor with the well-being of the temple and its patrons. Mentorship and alliances offered rare reprieves. Older priestesses sometimes guided younger women, offering advice on rituals, etiquette, and negotiation with visitors. Friendships provided emotional support and small comforts in an otherwise controlled environment. However, these bonds could not replace autonomy, and the women remained subject to institutional demands. Life in the temple was largely about endurance, strategy, and psychological resilience, punctuated by fleeting moments of minor advantage or respite. Ultimately, the Mesopotamian temple system was a paradoxical institution. It provided shelter, sustenance, and social recognition, but at the cost of freedom, personal identity, and bodily autonomy. Sacred prostitution framed women's labor as divine service, yet the reality was deeply exploitative, physically taxing, and socially isolating. The women were instruments of gods and temples, performing acts that were simultaneously honored and devalued, respected and exploited, revered and constrained. Beyond daily rituals, the psychological toll of temple life weighed heavily on these women. They grew up learning that their worth was measured by obedience, skill, and spiritual service, not personal desire or accomplishment. Mistakes could be punished, favoritism could determine comfort, and failure in rituals was both a spiritual and social transgression. Living under constant scrutiny, where every gesture was noted and evaluated, created a relentless stress that shaped personality, relationships, and sense of self. Physical endurance was paramount. Long hours of ritual service, performing chants, dances, and sexual acts, demanded strength and precision. Girls often began training at an early age, and by adolescence, their bodies were conditioned to meet the temple's rigorous standards. Any sign of fatigue, illness, or refusal could be met with correction, ranging from extra labor to public admonishment. Performance became both a duty and a survival strategy. Ensured minor privileges, failure carried tangible consequences. Economic realities reinforced the harshness. Temples were wealthy, powerful institutions, controlling vast resources, and sacred service directly contributed to their economic stability. Donations, offerings, and fees collected from worshippers were partially dependent on the labor and skill of temple prostitutes. Every act of service, therefore, was not only spiritual but also financial. Women became instruments of wealth, their bodies tied to income, prestige, and social influence of the temple. Social dynamics within the temple added another layer of complexity. Hierarchy was strict. Senior priestesses controlled daily routines, rituals, and distribution of privileges. Young recruits navigated these relationships cautiously, seeking favor without drawing attention or suspicion. Alliances could provide minor protections, friendship offered emotional relief, and subtle acts of strategy might spare extra labor or provide better sleeping arrangements. Yet these were small victories in a life largely dictated by institution and ritual. Gender and age influenced assignments. Older, experienced women often assumed administrative or supervisory roles, training newcomers, overseeing ceremonies, and mediating disputes. Younger women, meanwhile, carried the bulk of physically demanding and repetitive ritual work. Sexual service was regulated carefully. Some rituals required specific acts, sometimes repeatedly with different visitors, all framed as sacred duty. Compliance was mandatory, and resistance could not only damage status but also endanger the woman physically or socially. Training extended into skill acquisition beyond rituals. Girls learned to recite mythologies, sing sacred hymns, dance ceremonial steps, and handle ritual objects properly. Every performance contributed to the temple's prestige and ensured that worshippers believed in the sacredness of their service. Knowledge was not given for empowerment, but to refine obedience, precision, and the efficiency of ritual labor. Personal expression or emotional deviation was discouraged and sometimes punished. Interactions with patrons were complex. Worshippers, city officials, and sometimes foreign visitors engaged with temple women during ceremonies. Favorable interactions could improve quality of life, slightly better meals, minor privileges, or small social influence, while missteps or disinterest could bring disfavor. Women had to balance compliance, performance, and subtle negotiation constantly, aware that every action influenced both spiritual perception and social hierarchy. Even within sacred context, emotional strain was omnipresent. Young women faced isolation, social stigma outside the temple, and the difficulty of forming meaningful relationships. Marriage and family were often impossible, as temple service defined identity and status. Those who attempted to leave faced societal judgment and limited options, as their bodies and labor had been commodified for decades in sacred service. Freedom was theoretically possible but practically constrained. Daily life blurred the line between sacred and profane. While rituals framed acts as divine service, the repetitive nature and physical demand made them feel like labor. Temple prostitutes were revered as instruments of gods, yet exploited and controlled, creating constant tension between spiritual honor and human suffering. The paradox shaped identity, behavior, and mental resilience, forcing women to survive in a system designed to prioritize institutional needs over individual well-being. In essence, temple life was a careful choreography of obedience, endurance, and subtle negotiation. The women were constantly balancing physical, emotional, and social demands, navigating hierarchy, ritual precision, and external expectations. Sacred prostitution was not simply a role, it was a life-consuming institution that demanded complete adaptation, leaving little room for autonomy, personal identity, or private desire. As women grew older within the temple, their experience slightly altered their role, but did not grant true freedom. Seniority brought responsibilities such as mentoring younger recruits, supervising rituals, and even mediating conflicts between priestesses. Some women gained minor privileges, like better living quarters, more comfortable schedules, or influence over ceremonial assignments. However, these advantages were limited, always subordinate to the temple's hierarchy, and never equaled autonomy. The temple remained a system of control, and the experienced women were still instruments of ritual, financial contribution, and social perception. Daily routines were meticulously structured. Sunrise marked the beginning of ablutions, dressing, and prayer ceremonies. Meals were brief, functional, and largely repetitive, providing sustenance rather than pleasure. Physical maintenance was constant. Hair, clothing, posture, and appearance were scrutinized, reflecting both spiritual discipline and social expectation. Visitors, whether city officials, merchants, or pilgrims, evaluated performance visually and behaviorally, reinforcing that every action had consequences. Fatigue or misstep could lead to minor punishment, reassignment, or social disfavor, emphasizing the relentless scrutiny under which these women lived. Ritual sexual service, framed as sacred and divinely sanctioned, demanded both physical endurance and emotional detachment. Women had to perform acts repeatedly, often with multiple visitors in a single day. While rituals were designed to promote fertility, city prosperity, or religious observance, the reality was exhausting and emotionally taxing. Personal feelings, desires, and consent were secondary to religious duty. Over time, many women developed coping mechanisms, emotionally distancing themselves or mentally reframing actions as purely service to the gods. Education continued as a central aspect of temple life. Girls and women learned chants, ceremonial dances, mythological recitations, and correct handling of sacred objects. Skill mastery provided status, elevation, and minor comforts, but primarily served temple needs. Creativity or personal initiative was discouraged. Deviation from ritual precision could result in correction or social censure. Training, therefore, functioned as both empowerment within the temple hierarchy and a method of institutional control. Interactions with visitors were another source of complexity. Patrons' desires, preferences, and behavior could influence daily schedules, status, and minor privileges. Skilled women could sometimes leverage charm, intelligence, or ritual knowledge to gain favor, better conditions, or slight autonomy. Yet, the temple maintained ultimate authority. Favor was temporary, conditional, and could be revoked at any moment, reminding women that personal relationships were secondary to ritual obligations. The temple's economic role reinforced pressure. Donations, offerings, and ritual fees depended partly on women's performance and compliance. Their labor directly contributed to wealth accumulation, temple prestige, and the city's religious authority. Excellence brought minor rewards, while lapses could jeopardize comfort or status. In essence, women's bodies became instruments of economic, spiritual, and social function, with little room for personal choice. Social perception outside the temple was paradoxical. Women were honored as sacred instruments within the temple, yet stigmatized in broader society. Marriage, family life, and independent work were often unattainable, creating a cycle of dependence and constraint. Leaving the temple did not guarantee acceptance, as societal judgment often labeled former temple prostitutes as morally compromised or socially inferior. This duality reinforced the temple as both sanctuary and cage. Despite the challenges, some women exhibited resilience and strategy. Observing patterns, forming alliances, and navigating hierarchy allowed minor advantages. Emotional bonds, mentorship, and informal networks provided support, small comforts, and survival strategies. These moments, however, were exceptions. The temple's structure largely prioritized obedience, ritual precision, and institutional function over individual autonomy or well-being. Ultimately, life as a temple prostitute in Mesopotamia demanded endurance, strategic navigation of social hierarchies, and psychological resilience. Women were constantly negotiating their roles within a system that simultaneously honored and exploited them, balancing sacred duty, economic necessity, and social perception. Sacred service was inseparable from human labor, and the paradox of veneration and exploitation defined their existence for decades. Over time, the repetitive nature of temple life shaped both body and mind. Every day followed a rigid rhythm: washing, dressing, chanting, dancing, attending rituals, and performing sacred sexual duties. Physical endurance was tested constantly, as rituals sometimes demanded hours of standing, kneeling, or maintaining precise movements. The temple's environment, while architecturally magnificent, became a psychological cage. Every corridor and chamber reinforced hierarchy, control, and the omnipresent gaze of senior priestesses and visitors. The emotional toll was immense. Women were trained to perform devotion without complaint, to manage encounters with visitors without expressing personal preference, and to maintain composure in all situations. Social interactions within the temple were layered with subtle power dynamics. Senior priestesses wielded authority, while younger women navigated complex hierarchies to avoid punishment or gain minor privileges. Friendships formed, but trust was fragile. Loyalty could be rewarded or exploited. Survival required constant observation, emotional regulation, and strategic engagement with both peers and superiors. Ritual sexual service, though sanctified as divine duty, added a profound layer of pressure. Women were expected to perform with precision and consistency, often engaging with multiple visitors in a single day. Emotional detachment was essential. Personal discomfort or objection could compromise status, privileges, or even safety. While the acts were framed as service to the gods, they were also vital to the temple's financial and social standing. merging sacred duty with economic exploitation. Training in ritual knowledge extended beyond sexual duties. Girls learned mythologies, sacred chants, ceremonial dances, and precise handling of religious objects. Mastery offered small advantages, such as recognition or slightly improved conditions, but its primary purpose was compliance and effectiveness in ritual performance. Individuality and personal expression were discouraged, replaced by precision, repetition, and devotion to the temple's needs. Interactions with visitors required constant negotiation. Worshippers, merchants, and officials influenced daily schedules and status. Women had to balance obedience, charm, and ritual expertise, knowing that favorable impressions could bring minor rewards while missteps could result in reassignment or public correction. Their bodies and actions were both sacred instruments and social commodities, evaluated continuously within the temple hierarchy. Economic necessity amplified pressures. Temples relied on offerings, donations, and fees, with women's service contributing directly to institutional wealth. Their labor was both sacred and transactional, linking personal compliance to broader economic outcomes. Excellence in ritual performance could yield recognition, while fatigue or failure risked punishment, reinforcing the transactional nature of sacred service. Age and experience influenced roles, but autonomy remained limited. Older priestesses might oversee rituals or guide younger women, gaining minor influence and privileges. Yet even they remained bound by temple rules, ritual expectations, and institutional demands. The hierarchy maintained control, ensuring that compliance and productivity outweighed personal freedom or desire. Social life outside the temple offered little solace. Women who left service often faced stigma, limited employment options, and social suspicion. Marriage and family life were largely inaccessible, reinforcing dependence on the temple for both survival and identity. The paradox of sacred honor and social devaluation persisted, shaping both personal perception and societal interaction. Psychological resilience became a survival tool. Women learned to emotionally distance themselves from repetitive and demanding tasks, forming strategies to endure physical labor, social scrutiny, and ritual expectations. Some leveraged mentorship and alliances for minor advantages, but the temple's structure ensured that ultimate authority remained institutional, not personal. In sum, being a temple prostitute in Mesopotamia was a life-consuming, exhausting, and psychologically taxing experience. Sacred duty, ritual obligation, economic expectation, and social hierarchy intertwined to define existence. Women were honored as instruments of the gods, yet exploited as laborers. Caught in a system that demanded endurance, obedience, and strategic navigation of complex relationships. The paradox of reverence and exploitation defined their entire lives, leaving little room for autonomy, personal growth, or freedom. By the time a girl or young woman had spent several years in the temple, the routines became both familiar and oppressive. Dawn marked the beginning of carefully orchestrated rituals, including ablutions, dressing in ceremonial attire, and participation in prayers or chants. Physical conditioning and ritual training were ongoing, ensuring that each participant could meet the temple's demanding expectations. The women moved through vast courtyards and ornate chambers under the watchful eyes of senior priestesses and visiting patrons. Every gesture, expression, and action was observed, evaluated, and judged. The psychological weight of constant scrutiny was unrelenting. Each day demanded careful navigation of social hierarchies, ritual precision, and emotional self-regulation. Mistakes could lead to reprimands, additional labor, or subtle social penalties, emphasizing the necessity for constant alertness. Friendships within the temple were rare but valuable. Alliances provided emotional support, minor strategic advantage, and guidance in navigating the complex institutional structure. Yet even these bonds were vulnerable, as jealousy, competition, or favoritism could quickly undermine relationships. Sexual rituals, central to the institution of temple service, were demanding both physically and emotionally. While framed as acts of sacred devotion, women were required to engage with multiple visitors according to the temple's schedule and hierarchy. These encounters demanded endurance, precise adherence to ritual protocol, and emotional detachment. Personal desire or refusal had little influence over participation. The sacred framing provided justification, but it did not ease the burden, fatigue, or emotional toll associated with repetitive, regulated sexual labor. Education and skill acquisition reinforced the temple's system of control. Girls learned sacred hymns, mythological narratives, ceremonial dances, and the proper handling of ritual objects. Mastery conferred minor status advantages, but the primary aim was to refine their ability to serve, comply, and perform in accordance with temple standards. Individuality, creativity, and personal expression were suppressed in favor of uniformity, precision, and ritual compliance. Each action was measured against both spiritual and institutional expectations, leaving little room for personal identity. Interactions with visitors were another layer of complexity. Worshippers, city officials, and merchants influenced scheduling, status, and even minor privileges. Women had to balance compliance, charm, and ritual skill to maintain favor, navigate hierarchy, and avoid negative consequences. Successful interactions could offer small improvements in daily life, while errors or perceived lapses could result in additional labor or social censure. In essence, the women's bodies and behaviors were simultaneously sacred instruments, social commodities, and economic contributors. Economic dependence, heightened pressures. Temples relied on donations, ritual fees, and offerings, and the women's labor was essential to sustaining both the institution and its influence in the community. Performance had spiritual, social, and economic consequences. Excellence was rewarded with minor privileges, while fatigue or non-compliance carried tangible costs. Women were inextricably tied to the temple's wealth and reputation, their daily labor contributing directly to institutional survival and prosperity. Seniority brought slight autonomy, but within limits. Experienced priestesses might oversee younger recruits, manage ceremonial assignments, and mediate disputes. Some gained temporary privileges, better quarters, or influence over minor rituals. However, institutional authority always superseded personal discretion, and even senior women remained instruments of the temple's religious, social, and economic objectives. Autonomy was partial, conditional, and never complete. Life beyond the temple offered limited options. Women leaving service often faced social stigma, restricted employment opportunities, and challenges in marriage or family life. Their bodies and labor, once commodified and ritualized, were not easily reintegrated into broader society. The paradox persisted, honored as sacred within the temple, yet devalued and marginalized outside it. This tension shaped identity, perception, and potential for personal freedom. Survival strategies emerged as necessity. Women developed emotional detachment, mental reframing, and careful observation to cope with the relentless demands. Mentorship and alliances offered small advantages, while careful compliance minimized punishment. Yet, the institutional structure ensured that ultimate control remained with the temple hierarchy, leaving women perpetually constrained, both physically and psychologically. In conclusion, temple prostitution in Mesopotamia was a life of enduring structure, relentless demand, and constrained autonomy. Sacred service, ritual precision, social hierarchy, and economic dependence intertwined to shape existence. Women were revered as instruments of divine will, yet exploited as laborers, caught in a system that demanded constant endurance, obedience, and strategy. Their paradoxical lives combined honor, exploitation, control, and survival in ways that defined their existence for decades. By this stage of temple life, women had become deeply enmeshed in the routines, expectations, and hierarchy of the institution. Days were long, repetitive, and meticulously organized. From pre-dawn ablutions to ceremonial preparations, chanting, dancing, and ritual sexual duties, there was little space for personal choice or leisure. Each movement and action was observed, evaluated, and controlled, shaping both the body and mind over time. The temple was magnificent to outsiders, adorned with intricate carvings, towering ziggurats, and golden altars, yet for those living inside, it functioned as a carefully structured cage. Psychological stress was relentless. Women navigated complex social hierarchies, monitored performance, and maintained emotional composure at all times. Mistakes or disobedience could lead to punishment, additional labor, or public admonishment. Relationships within the temple were complicated. Alliances and mentorship offered small advantages, while competition and favoritism could destabilize even the most careful strategies. Emotional resilience was critical for survival, and many women developed mental techniques to endure the relentless pressures of daily life. Physical endurance was equally demanding. Ritual sexual duties required repeated participation, often with multiple visitors per day. While framed as sacred service, the labor was physically taxing and emotionally draining. Personal preference, consent, or desire played little role. Women learned early to detach emotionally, viewing acts as duty rather than personal interaction. The framing of sacred purpose provided social and religious justification, but did not mitigate the exhaustion, monotony, or emotional impact of repeated service. Training and education reinforced control. Women learned sacred hymns, ceremonial dances, mythological recitations, and proper handling of ritual objects. Mastery offered minor privileges or recognition, but primarily ensured compliance and effectiveness. Personal expression or creativity was discouraged. Deviation from ritual expectations risked reprimand. Each action was measured, monitored, and evaluated for both spiritual and institutional conformity. In essence, skill and obedience were inseparable from survival. Visitors influenced life within the temple. Worshippers, merchants, and city officials interacted with women according to the temple's schedule and hierarchy. Favorable encounters could yield minor advantages such as improved meals, better sleeping quarters, or temporary exemptions from demanding rituals. Conversely, missteps could lead to punishment or loss of privileges. Women had to carefully balance compliance, ritual expertise, and subtle negotiation to maintain social standing and avoid adverse consequences. Economic dependency intensified pressure. The temple's wealth relied on donations, ritual fees, and offerings, with women's labor contributing directly to institutional success. Each act of service carried not only spiritual but also financial weight. Performance excellence could improve comfort and status, while lapses could result in punishment or additional labor. Their bodies were simultaneously sacred instruments, economic contributors, and social symbols, entwining personal labor with institutional prosperity. Seniority brought slight privileges but not freedom. Experienced priestesses could oversee ceremonies, assign duties, or mentor newcomers. Some gained temporary influence or minor comforts, yet ultimate control remained with the temple hierarchy. Autonomy was partial, conditional, and constantly mediated by institutional demands. Even those in leadership were instruments of a system that prioritized ritual, obedience, and economic contribution above personal well-being. Life outside the temple remained fraught with difficulty. Women leaving service were often stigmatized, with limited social and economic options. Marriage, family life, and independent work were difficult or impossible due to societal perception. The paradox endured, revered inside as sacred instruments, yet marginalized and devalued outside. Temple service shaped identity, behavior, and long-term prospects, creating lasting psychological and social consequences. Strategies for coping became essential. Emotional detachment, observation, and subtle negotiation allowed women to navigate hierarchy and avoid punishment. Mentorship and alliances provided support, comfort, and occasional minor advantages. Yet, the structure of the temple ensured that ultimate authority remained institutional. Personal choice, identity, and freedom were largely constrained, reinforcing the temple's dual nature as protector and enforcer. In conclusion, temple prostitution in Mesopotamia demanded endurance, discipline, and strategic survival. Sacred duty intertwined with labor, hierarchy, and social expectation, creating a paradoxical existence. Women were honored as instruments of divine will, yet exploited for economic and institutional gain. Their lives were defined by ritual, control, and survival, leaving little room for personal autonomy, emotional fulfillment, or societal acceptance. By the midpoint of temple service, the routine was both familiar and inescapable. Women had internalized the schedule: pre-dawn ablutions, ceremonial dressing, chanting, dancing, and participation in ritual sexual acts. Every gesture was scrutinized, every word weighed. The temple's grandeur, the towering ziggurats, elaborate carvings, and golden altars did little to soften the rigidity of life inside. For the women, magnificence was accompanied by confinement, surveillance, and the constant pressure to perform perfectly. Psychological strain was constant. Each interaction with a senior priestess or visitor required careful navigation of hierarchy, subtle observation, and emotional control. Mistakes could result in punishment, reassignment, or social censure. Friendships offered brief solace, but loyalty was precarious. Competition and favoritism could disrupt even well-planned alliances. Emotional resilience became essential, with women developing strategies to cope with exhaustion, stress, and the relentless demands of ritual life. Physical labor was grueling. Ritual sexual duties demanded endurance and consistency, often with multiple participants per day. While framed as sacred service, the acts were repetitive, physically exhausting, and emotionally taxing. Women had to detach from personal feelings, viewing service as duty rather than personal interaction. Sacred framing provided legitimacy but did not alleviate the monotony, fatigue, or psychological impact. Education reinforced institutional control. Women learned to recite hymns, memorize mythological narratives, perform ceremonial dances, and handle sacred objects correctly. Mastery afforded minor status and comfort improvements, but primarily ensured ritual efficiency and obedience. Personal expression was discouraged. Deviation from strict norms could result in reprimand or loss of privileges. Knowledge was a tool for both religious devotion and institutional control, emphasizing compliance over autonomy. Interactions with visitors were complex and impactful. Worshippers, merchants, and city officials influenced status, privileges, and daily routines. Favorable encounters could yield slightly better conditions or recognition, while missteps could lead to punishment, additional labor, or social disadvantage. Women learned to negotiate subtly, balancing obedience, ritual skill, and social awareness to maintain status and avoid repercussions. Economic dependency intensified pressure. Temples relied on offerings, donations, and ritual fees, with women's labor contributing directly to institutional wealth and social prestige. Performance excellence was rewarded with minor comforts, while mistakes or fatigue could reduce privileges or impose extra labor. Women's bodies were instruments of sacred, economic, and social significance, entwining personal effort with institutional function. Seniority brought limited autonomy. Experienced priestesses could mentor younger recruits, assign duties, and oversee ceremonies. Some gained small privileges or minor influence, but institutional authority remained supreme. Even those in positions of relative power were still subject to ritual rules, hierarchy, and the economic demands of the temple. True autonomy was rare and partial. Framed within the constraints of institutional needs, life beyond the temple remained difficult. Women leaving service faced stigma, limited opportunities, and challenges in marriage or family life. Their years of ritual labor and sacred service made reintegration into broader society complicated. Inside the temple, they were revered as sacred instruments. Outside, they were marginalized and judged. This paradoxical social position reinforced the temple's role as both protector and constraint. Coping strategies were crucial. Emotional detachment, careful observation, and subtle negotiation allowed survival within the hierarchical and demanding system. Mentorship and alliances offered minor relief and temporary advantages. Yet, ultimate control remained with the temple hierarchy, ensuring that personal choice and freedom were severely limited. In summary, temple prostitution in Mesopotamia demanded constant endurance, compliance, and strategy. Sacred duty, ritual obligation, economic necessity, and social hierarchy intertwined, shaping every aspect of women's lives. They were honored as instruments of divine will but exploited as laborers, navigating a system that combined reverence, control, and survival into a paradoxical existence that defined their lives for decades. As women advanced in years within the temple, routines became deeply ingrained but no less taxing. Dawn still brought ablutions, ceremonial dressing, chanting, and participation in ritual duties, both physical and sexual. Every gesture, word, and movement was monitored, evaluated, and often corrected. The grandeur of ziggurats' carved walls and golden altars was inescapable, but for the women living inside, it was a constant reminder of hierarchy, expectation, and control. The magnificence that impressed visitors was simultaneously a cage that constrained daily life. The psychological burden was immense. Daily interactions with senior priestesses or visitors required vigilance, careful observation, and emotional regulation. Mistakes could lead to punishment, social censure, or additional labor. Alliances and friendships offered temporary support, but trust was fragile. Jealousy, competition, or favor could destabilize relationships at any moment. Emotional resilience became a survival mechanism, shaping personality, behavior, and the ways women navigated authority and expectation. Physical demands were unrelenting. Ritual sexual duties often required engagement with multiple visitors per day, demanding endurance and detachment. While framed as sacred service, the labor was repetitive, exhausting, and emotionally draining. Detachment became a necessary coping mechanism. Personal feelings and desires were suppressed to meet the requirements of the temple. Sacred framing provided legitimacy but did not reduce the fatigue, monotony, or psychological toll. Education was part of daily life. Girls learned sacred chants, mythological narratives, ceremonial dances, and proper handling of ritual objects. Proficiency brought minor privileges or recognition, but primarily ensured obedience and efficiency in ritual performance. Personal creativity or deviation was discouraged. The focus was on ritual precision and compliance. Knowledge became a tool for control as much as for spiritual education, reinforcing the temple's authority over body and mind. Interactions with visitors shaped social standing. Worshippers, officials, and merchants could influence daily life, privileges, and minor status. Favorable encounters might bring slightly better conditions or recognition, while mistakes could lead to punishment or loss of privileges. Women learned to balance obedience, ritual skill, and subtle negotiation to maintain favor, survival, and minor advantages. Every interaction carried social, spiritual, and institutional weight, intertwining personal actions with broader consequences. Economic dependence heightened the pressure. The temple relied on donations, fees, and offerings, with women's labor directly contributing to institutional wealth and social influence. Excellence in performance could yield minor comforts. Fatigue or failure risked punishment or additional duties. Women's labor was inseparable from the temple's financial and social stability, merging sacred service with economic necessity. Seniority conferred small privileges but limited autonomy. Experienced priestesses might supervise younger recruits, assign duties, and oversee rituals. Some gained temporary comforts, influence, or minor exemptions, yet ultimate control remained with the temple hierarchy. Autonomy was always conditional, constrained by ritual, hierarchy, and institutional priorities. Even leadership roles did not guarantee freedom. The temple's needs came first. Life outside the temple remained difficult. Women leaving service faced stigma, limited options, and social isolation. Marriage and family life were often inaccessible due to years of ritual labor. Inside, they were honored as sacred instruments. Outside, they were judged and marginalized. This paradox reinforced dependence on the temple and highlighted the constrained nature of freedom and social acceptance. Survival required strategy. Women relied on emotional detachment, careful observation, and tactical navigation of hierarchy. Mentorship and alliances offered small advantages, but ultimate control rested with the institution. Daily existence was a careful balance between endurance, ritual duty, and strategic adaptation to maintain safety, status, and minor comfort. Ultimately, life as a temple prostitute in Mesopotamia demanded endurance, compliance, and resilience. Sacred duty, ritual obligation, social hierarchy, and economic necessity were inseparably entwined, defining every aspect of daily existence. Women were honored as instruments of divine will, yet exploited as laborers, navigating a system that combined reverence, control, and survival into a paradoxical life that lasted for decades. As the years accumulated, women within the temple became deeply accustomed to routines, yet the demands never eased. Dawn brought pre-ritual ablutions, ceremonial dressing, chanting, dancing, and sexual duties, each step strictly monitored and evaluated. Even small errors were noticed, corrected, or punished. The grandeur of the temple, the towering ziggurats, carved walls, and golden altars was as much a reminder of power and hierarchy as it was of devotion. Magnificent architecture impressed outsiders but reinforced the women's confinement. As every movement and choice was observed and judged, psychological pressure remained relentless. Women navigated intricate hierarchies, monitored their own behavior constantly, and maintained strict emotional control. Mistakes could result in reprimands, additional labor, or loss of privileges. Friendships and mentorships provided temporary support, but competition, favoritism, and jealousy were constant challenges. Women developed coping mechanisms to survive emotional detachment. Strategic observation and careful negotiation became essential tools in maintaining both status and mental well-being. Physical demands were severe. Ritual sexual duties, framed as sacred, required endurance and detachment, often involving multiple participants in a single day. The acts were physically exhausting, repetitive, and emotionally taxing. Women learned to dissociate personal feelings from duty, focusing on ritual performance rather than desire. The sacred context gave spiritual legitimacy, but could not diminish the fatigue, monotony, or emotional strain inherent in daily life. Education was comprehensive but controlled. Women mastered sacred hymns, mythological stories, ceremonial dances, and proper handling of ritual objects. Skill brought recognition or minor improvements in daily comfort, but primarily ensured efficiency, obedience, and institutional control. Creativity, personal preference, or deviation from prescribed norms was discouraged, leaving little space for self-expression. Knowledge served as both empowerment within the temple and reinforcement of institutional authority, shaping both mind and body. Interactions with visitors were complex and influential. Worshippers, city officials, and merchants participated in rituals and could affect privileges, scheduling, and social status. Positive encounters could lead to better meals, improved sleeping quarters, or temporary relief from demanding tasks, while mistakes could result in punishment, loss of privileges, or additional labor. Every interaction required careful balance between ritual compliance, social acumen, and strategic negotiation, emphasizing the constant pressure women lived under. Economic dependence magnified stress. Temples relied on offerings, donations, and ritual fees, with women's labor directly contributing to institutional wealth and social standing. Performance excellence could improve minor comforts, while lapses risked punishment or increased labor. Women's bodies were both sacred instruments and economic tools. Their labor, inseparable from the temple's financial stability, seniority, brought some advantages but never complete freedom. Experienced priestesses supervised younger recruits, managed ceremonial assignments, and occasionally mediated conflicts. Minor privileges or temporary influence could be gained, but ultimate authority remained with the temple hierarchy. Even women in leadership roles were bound by ritual rules, institutional expectations, and the economic demands of the temple. Autonomy was always partial and conditional. Life outside the temple remained harsh and uncertain. Former temple prostitutes faced social stigma, restricted opportunities, and challenges in family and marital life. Their years of ritual labor and sacred service limited reintegration, reinforcing dependence on the temple. Within the institution, they were revered as sacred instruments. Outside, they were judged, marginalized, and socially constrained. This duality defined both identity and prospects, emphasizing the paradox of sacred service. Coping strategies were critical. Emotional detachment, careful observation, and strategic alliances allowed survival. Mentorship provided guidance, minor relief, and emotional support. Yet, ultimate control remained institutional. Daily existence was a delicate balance between endurance, ritual precision, and strategic negotiation to maintain status, privileges, and psychological resilience. In essence, being a temple prostitute in Mesopotamia demanded constant vigilance, endurance, and adaptation. Sacred service intertwined with ritual obligation, hierarchy, and economic necessity to shape every aspect of life. Women were simultaneously honored as instruments of divine will and exploited as laborers, navigating a system that merged reverence, control, and survival into a lifelong, paradoxical existence. By this point, many women had spent years, even decades, inside the temple. The routines had become second nature, yet remained as demanding and controlling as ever. Dawn began with ablutions, ceremonial dressing, chanting, dancing, and ritual duties, both religious and sexual. Every gesture and movement was observed by senior priestesses and visitors alike. Mistakes were noted, sometimes punished, reinforcing the constant vigilance required to navigate daily life. The grandeur of the temple, with its ziggurats, golden altars, and intricate carvings impressed outsiders, but for the women living there, it was a structure of confinement and control. Psychological strain was unrelenting. Daily life required constant observation, emotional regulation, and navigation of hierarchies. Mistakes could bring punishment, additional labor, or social disfavor. Friendships provided temporary relief, but trust was fragile. Favoritism, rivalry, and subtle manipulation could easily destabilize relationships. Women developed resilience and strategic thinking to survive, often emotionally detaching themselves from repetitive duties and stressful social dynamics. The physical demands remained punishing. Ritual sexual service was framed as sacred, but it was repetitive, exhausting, and emotionally draining. Women often engaged with multiple visitors in a single day, requiring endurance, precision, and emotional detachment. The sacred framing offered legitimacy, but could not lessen fatigue, discomfort, or monotony. Performance was essential for status, privileges, and institutional function, leaving little room for personal preference or desire. Education reinforced both control and status. Women learned hymns, ceremonial dances, mythological recitations, and proper handling of ritual objects. Mastery brought minor advantages, such as slightly improved conditions or recognition, but the primary goal was compliance and ritual precision. Personal expression was discouraged, and deviation from expectations could result in punishment or loss of privileges. Knowledge became a tool for institutional authority as much as spiritual development. Interactions with visitors carried social weight. Worshippers, city officials, and merchants could influence scheduling, privileges, and social perception. Favorable encounters might improve comfort, while errors could result in punishment or additional labor. Women had to negotiate carefully, balancing compliance, ritual skill, and subtle social maneuvering to maintain minor advantages and survive the institution's pressures. Economic dependence added further pressure. Temples relied on donations, offerings, and ritual fees, with women's labor integral to financial and social stability. Excellence in performance could yield minor comfort, while mistakes could result in punishment or increased labor. Women's labor was inseparable from the temple's wealth and influence, making every act both sacred and transactional. Seniority offered small benefits, but not freedom. Experienced priestesses could assign duties, mentor younger recruits, and occasionally influence minor ceremonial decisions. Minor privileges, slightly better quarters, or temporary relief from duties were possible, but ultimate control rested with the temple hierarchy. Even those in leadership roles were constrained by ritual requirements and institutional demands, ensuring that autonomy was limited and conditional. Life outside the temple remained fraught. Women who left faced stigma, limited employment, and social marginalization. Years of ritual labor and sacred service shaped identity and constrained reintegration. Inside, they were honored as instruments of divine will. Outside, they were judged and often devalued. The paradox between reverence within and marginalization without defined much of their personal and social existence. Coping strategies became essential. Emotional detachment, careful observation, and strategic alliances allowed survival in an environment of constant scrutiny and labor. Mentorship offered guidance and minor relief, yet the ultimate authority of the temple ensured that personal freedom was always limited. Life required continuous adaptation, endurance, and psychological resilience. In sum, temple prostitution in Mesopotamia demanded survival skills, compliance, and endurance. Sacred service, ritual obligation, hierarchy, and economic necessity intertwined to shape every aspect of daily existence. Women were honored as instruments of the gods, yet exploited as laborers, caught in a paradoxical system of reverence, control, and survival that defined decades of their lives. By now, women in the temple had often spent a significant portion of their lives within its walls. Each day was a carefully orchestrated cycle: pre-dawn ablutions, dressing in ceremonial garb, participating in chants, dances, and ritual sexual duties. Every action was observed, every gesture evaluated. Mistakes could be punished or corrected, reinforcing constant vigilance. The temple's grandeur, the towering ziggurats, golden altars, and intricate carvings impressed outsiders, but for the women, it represented confinement, hierarchy, and control. Magnificence existed alongside the inescapable structure of institutional expectation. Psychological strain remained omnipresent. Women navigated complex hierarchies, constantly monitoring their behavior and emotional state. Mistakes could result in punishment, loss of privileges, or social disfavor. Alliances and friendships offered temporary relief, but were fraught with risk. Favoritism, rivalry, and subtle manipulation could easily undermine trust. Survival required careful observation, strategic thinking, and emotional detachment to cope with the relentless pressures of ritual life. Physical labor was equally demanding. Ritual sexual duties, though framed as sacred service, were repetitive, exhausting, and emotionally taxing. Women often engaged with multiple visitors each day, requiring endurance, precision, and emotional detachment. Sacred framing offered legitimacy, but could not alleviate the fatigue, monotony, or emotional toll. Success and status depended on compliance and performance, leaving little room for personal preference or desire. Education continued as a central part of daily life. Girls mastered hymns, ceremonial dances, mythological recitations, and correct handling of sacred objects. Skill mastery provided minor privileges or recognition, but primarily reinforced obedience and institutional control. Individual creativity or deviation was discouraged, and errors could result in punishment or loss of status. Knowledge served both spiritual and institutional purposes, shaping minds while maintaining compliance. Interactions with visitors were socially consequential. Worshippers, city officials, and merchants could influence privileges, schedules, and social perception. Positive interactions might improve comfort or provide minor advantages, while mistakes could result in punishment or added labor. Women learned to negotiate subtly, balancing obedience, ritual skill, and social awareness to maintain status and safety. Their bodies and actions were both sacred instruments and social commodities. Economic dependence, heightened pressure. Temples relied on offerings, donations, and fees, with women's labor essential to institutional wealth and influence. Excellence in performance could lead to slight improvements in comfort or recognition, while mistakes risked punishment or increased workload. Women's labor was inseparable from the temple's financial and social function, merging sacred service with economic necessity. Seniority brought minor advantages, but not freedom. Experienced priestesses could mentor younger recruits, assign duties, and oversee certain ceremonies. Some gained temporary privileges, better quarters, or influence over minor tasks. Yet ultimate authority remained with the temple hierarchy, and autonomy was always partial and conditional. Even women in leadership were bound by ritual, hierarchy, and institutional needs. Life outside the temple offered limited options. Women leaving service faced stigma, restricted employment, and social marginalization. Marriage and family life were often inaccessible. Within the temple, they were revered as sacred instruments. Outside, they were judged and devalued. This paradox reinforced dependence on the temple and shaped personal identity, social perception, and long-term prospects. Coping mechanisms were essential. Emotional detachment, careful observation, and strategic alliances allowed survival in a system of constant scrutiny and labor. Mentorship provided guidance, support, and minor advantages. Yet, ultimate control remained with the temple institution. Life required constant adaptation, endurance, and psychological resilience to navigate the interwoven demands of ritual, hierarchy, and social expectation. In essence, temple prostitution in Mesopotamia demanded continuous endurance, compliance, and adaptation. Sacred service, ritual obligation, social hierarchy, and economic necessity intertwined to define every aspect of existence. Women were honored as instruments of divine will, yet exploited as laborers, navigating a system that combined reverence, control, and survival into a lifelong, paradoxical experience. By this stage, the temple had become both home and cage for many women. Daily routines were rigidly structured: pre-dawn ablutions, ceremonial dressing, participation in chants and dances, and ritual sexual duties. Each movement, gesture, and word was scrutinized by senior priestesses and visitors. Mistakes could lead to punishment, extra labor, or social disfavor. The architectural splendor of golden altars and carved walls impressed outsiders, but for women living inside, magnificence was inseparable from strict control and hierarchical oversight. Psychological strain was constant and inescapable. Women had to navigate intricate social hierarchies, regulate emotions, and monitor behavior. Mistakes could have consequences ranging from minor reprimands to additional duties. Friendships offered brief relief, but favoritism, jealousy, and competition complicated relationships. Survival required careful observation, emotional regulation, and strategic decision-making to avoid punishment and maintain minor privileges. Physical endurance was critical. Ritual sexual duties, though considered sacred, were repetitive and exhausting. Women were often required to engage with multiple visitors in a single day, demanding physical stamina and emotional detachment. Sacred framing lent legitimacy, but it could not mitigate fatigue, discomfort, or psychological strain. Compliance and performance were essential for status and privileges, leaving little room for personal choice or autonomy. Education was structured to reinforce obedience and institutional control. Women learned hymns, ceremonial dances, mythological stories, and proper handling of ritual objects. Mastery provided recognition and minor comforts, but primarily ensured ritual efficiency and compliance. Personal creativity and deviation were discouraged. Knowledge functioned both as spiritual training and as a method of institutional authority, shaping minds while maintaining strict control over behavior. Interactions with visitors carried significant social weight. Worshippers, merchants, and city officials influenced privileges, daily routines, and reputation. Positive encounters could result in improved living conditions or recognition, while mistakes risked punishment or increased labor. Women learned to navigate these interactions carefully, balancing ritual compliance, social awareness, and strategic negotiation. Their actions were simultaneously sacred service and social performance. Economic pressure amplified the burden. Temples depended on offerings, donations, and fees, with women's labor essential to maintaining wealth and influence. Excellence could improve conditions or status. Fatigue or errors could lead to punishment or extra duties. Their labor was both sacred and transactional, tightly interwoven with institutional prosperity. Seniority offered slight autonomy, but never true freedom. Experienced priestesses might assign tasks, mentor younger recruits, or supervise minor ceremonies. Small privileges or temporary exemptions were possible, yet ultimate control remained with the temple hierarchy. Even leadership roles came with constraints, as ritual expectations and institutional priorities dominated daily life. Life outside the temple remained precarious. Former temple prostitutes faced social stigma, limited employment opportunities, and challenges in marriage or family life. Their years of ritual labor and sacred service constrained reintegration into broader society. Inside the temple, women were revered as sacred instruments. Outside, they were often judged and marginalized. This paradox defined both personal identity and social positioning, reinforcing dependence on the institution. Coping mechanisms were essential for survival. Emotional detachment, careful observation, and strategic alliances allowed women to endure constant scrutiny, labor, and hierarchy. Mentorship and informal networks offered minor relief, guidance, and temporary advantages, yet ultimate authority remained institutional, limiting personal freedom and autonomy. Daily existence required endurance, compliance, and psychological resilience to navigate intertwined spiritual, social, and economic demands. In summary, temple prostitution in Mesopotamia demanded enduring strength, obedience, and adaptation. Sacred service, ritual obligation, hierarchy, and economic necessity shaped every aspect of life. Women were honored as instruments of divine will, yet exploited as laborers, navigating a system that combined reverence, control, and survival into a complex, lifelong experience. As women spent more years inside the temple, life became both routine and relentless. Each day followed the same structured rhythm: pre-dawn ablutions, ceremonial dressing, chanting, dancing, and ritual sexual duties. Every action was monitored, every gesture evaluated. Mistakes could result in punishment, reassignment, or social disfavor. The architectural grandeur of ziggurats, golden altars, and carved walls impressed outsiders. But for the women living inside, it symbolized hierarchy, control, and confinement. The temple was magnificent, yet inescapably rigid. Psychological pressures remained unceasing. Women had to navigate complex hierarchies, constantly monitor their behavior, and maintain strict emotional control. Missteps could have consequences ranging from minor reprimands to additional labor. Alliances and friendships provided brief support but were fragile, threatened by competition, jealousy, and favoritism. Survival required constant vigilance, strategic thinking, and emotional detachment. Women learned to compartmentalize emotionally, distancing themselves from repetitive tasks and stressful social dynamics. Physical demands were intense. Ritual sexual duties, framed as sacred service, were repetitive and exhausting. Women often engaged with multiple participants per day, requiring stamina, precision, and detachment. Sacred framing offered spiritual legitimacy, but could not ease fatigue, monotony, or emotional strain. Success in performance influenced status, privileges, and even access to minor comforts, leaving little space for personal choice or autonomy. Education reinforced obedience and institutional control. Women mastered hymns, ceremonial dances, mythological recitations, and proper handling of sacred objects. Skill provided minor recognition and slight advantages, but primarily ensured efficiency and compliance. Personal expression and deviation from expectations were discouraged, with errors resulting in punishment or loss of privileges. Knowledge served both spiritual and institutional purposes, shaping minds while maintaining behavioral control. Interactions with visitors were socially and strategically significant. Worshippers, officials, and merchants could influence privileges, schedules, and reputation. Positive interactions might result in improved quarters, meals, or recognition. Errors could bring punishment or added labor. Women learned to negotiate carefully, balancing ritual compliance, social skill, and subtle strategic moves. Their bodies and actions were simultaneously sacred instruments and social commodities. Evaluated continuously within the temple hierarchy, economic dependence intensified stress. Temples relied on donations, fees, and offerings, with women's labor essential to institutional wealth and influence. Excellence could improve conditions, while fatigue or missteps could lead to punishment or additional work. Their labor was inseparable from temple prosperity, making every act both sacred and transactional. Seniority brought minor privileges but not real autonomy. Experienced priestesses could assign duties, mentor younger women, and oversee minor ceremonies. Temporary exemptions or better quarters were possible, but ultimate control always rested with the temple hierarchy. Even those in leadership roles were bound by ritual requirements and institutional priorities. Autonomy was always limited and conditional, tied to obedience and performance. Life outside the temple remained challenging. Former temple prostitutes faced social stigma, limited employment opportunities, and difficulties in marriage or family life. Years of ritual labor and sacred service complicated reintegration into society. Inside the temple, they were revered as instruments of divine will. Outside, they were often judged and marginalized. This duality shaped identity, social positioning, and long-term prospects, reinforcing dependence on the institution. Coping strategies were critical. Emotional detachment, observation, and strategic alliances allowed women to navigate constant scrutiny, labor, and hierarchy. Mentorship offered guidance, support, and minor advantages. Yet ultimate control rested with the institution, ensuring personal freedom remained restricted. Daily life required endurance, compliance, and psychological resilience to survive the intertwined spiritual, social, and economic pressures. In conclusion, temple prostitution in Mesopotamia demanded endurance, strategic compliance, and adaptability. Sacred service, ritual obligation, hierarchy, and economic necessity governed every aspect of life. Women were simultaneously honored as instruments of divine will and exploited as laborers, navigating a system that merged reverence, control, and survival into a lifelong, paradoxical existence. As years passed, life in the temple became both familiar and relentless for the women living there. Each day began before sunrise with ablutions, ceremonial dressing, chanting, and participation in dances and ritual duties. Every action was watched, every movement scrutinized. Mistakes could result in reprimands, extra labor, or social disfavor. The temple's grandeur, the towering ziggurats, golden altars, and intricate carvings impressed outsiders, but was a constant reminder of hierarchy, control, and confinement for those inside. Magnificence and restriction coexisted, creating a complex daily environment. Psychological stress was constant and pervasive. Women had to navigate complex hierarchies, regulate emotions, and carefully monitor behavior. Missteps could bring punishment, added labor, or social repercussions. Friendships and mentorships offered temporary relief, but favoritism, rivalry, and jealousy could quickly destabilize them. Survival required strategic thinking, careful observation, and emotional detachment. Many women developed techniques to compartmentalize, separating their personal emotions from the repetitive and demanding tasks required by the temple. Physical demands remained grueling. Ritual sexual duties, framed as sacred service, were repetitive and exhausting. Women often engaged with multiple visitors daily, requiring both endurance and emotional detachment. Although the sacred context gave legitimacy to these acts, it did not reduce fatigue, monotony, or psychological strain. Success in performance affected status, privileges, and comfort, leaving little room for personal choice or autonomy. Education and skill training reinforced control. Women learned sacred hymns, ceremonial dances, mythological stories, and correct handling of ritual objects. Mastery offered minor advantages and recognition, but primarily ensured obedience, efficiency, and ritual precision. Individual creativity or deviation was discouraged, with errors potentially resulting in punishment or loss of privileges. Knowledge functioned as both spiritual instruction and a mechanism of institutional control, shaping behavior while enforcing compliance. Interactions with visitors carried social and strategic consequences. Worshippers, officials, and merchants could influence privileges, routines, and status. Positive encounters could bring minor comfort or recognition, while mistakes risked punishment or additional labor. Women navigated these interactions with careful observation, social awareness, and subtle negotiation, understanding that their bodies and actions were simultaneously instruments of sacred service. Economic contribution and social performance. Economic dependence intensified pressures. Temples relied on donations, offerings, and ritual fees, with women's labor integral to institutional wealth and social standing. Excellence in performance could yield minor improvements in comfort, while fatigue or missteps could result in punishment or extra duties. Every act was both sacred and transactional, intertwining spiritual service with economic necessity. Seniority offered slight privileges but limited autonomy. Experienced priestesses could assign duties, mentor younger recruits, and supervise minor ceremonies. Temporary exemptions or slightly improved living conditions were possible. Yet ultimate authority rested with the temple hierarchy. Even women in positions of leadership were constrained by ritual, hierarchy, and institutional needs. True autonomy remained conditional and partial, tied to obedience and performance. Life beyond the temple remained difficult. Former temple prostitutes faced social stigma, limited employment opportunities, and challenges in marriage or family life. Years of ritual labor and sacred service complicated Inside the temple, women were revered as sacred instruments. Outside, they were often judged and marginalized. This paradox shaped personal identity, social perception, and long-term prospects, reinforcing dependence on the institution. Coping strategies were essential. Emotional detachment, careful observation, and strategic alliances allowed women to endure the constant demands of labor, ritual, and hierarchy. Mentorship provided guidance, support, and minor advantages, yet ultimate control rested with the institution, limiting personal freedom and shaping daily existence. Endurance, compliance, and psychological resilience were critical for survival in this environment. In essence, temple prostitution in Mesopotamia demanded continuous strength, adaptability, and compliance. Sacred service, ritual obligation, hierarchy, and economic necessity defined every aspect of life. Women were simultaneously honored as instruments of divine will and exploited as laborers, navigating a system that merged reverence, control, and survival into a lifelong, paradoxical experience. By now, many women had spent years or even decades within the temple, and life was both familiar and unrelenting. Each day began with pre-dawn ablutions, ceremonial dressing, chanting, dancing, and ritual sexual duties. Every gesture, movement, and word was observed and evaluated. Mistakes could lead to punishment, additional labor, or social consequences. The temple's architectural grandeur, towering ziggurats, golden altars, and intricate carvings impressed outsiders. But for women inside, it symbolized hierarchy, control, and confinement. Magnificence coexisted with strict regulation, creating a complex and demanding environment. Psychological pressures were constant. Women had to navigate intricate hierarchies, regulate emotions, and maintain careful attention to behavior. Missteps could result in punishment, social disfavor, or increased workload. Friendships offered brief relief, but were fragile, threatened by jealousy, competition, and favoritism. Survival required careful observation, strategic thinking, and emotional detachment. Women learned to compartmentalize, separating personal emotions from the repetitive and demanding duties required by the temple. Physical demands remained intense. Ritual sexual duties, though framed as sacred, were repetitive, exhausting, and emotionally taxing. Women often engaged with multiple visitors daily, requiring stamina, precision, and detachment. Sacred framing lent legitimacy, but did not reduce fatigue, monotony, or psychological strain. Success affected privileges, status, and minor comforts, leaving little room for personal choice or autonomy. Education reinforced obedience and control. Women mastered hymns, ceremonial dances, mythological narratives, and proper handling of ritual objects. Proficiency brought recognition or slight advantages, but primarily ensured ritual efficiency and institutional compliance. Creativity or deviation was discouraged, and mistakes could result in punishment or loss of privileges. Knowledge functioned as both spiritual instruction and a mechanism of social and institutional control. Interactions with visitors were strategically significant. Worshippers, city officials, and merchants could affect status, privileges, and daily routines. Positive interactions might improve comfort, meals, or recognition, while mistakes could bring punishment or additional duties. Women learned to navigate these interactions carefully, balancing obedience, ritual skill, and subtle negotiation. Their actions and bodies were simultaneously sacred instruments, social symbols, and economic contributors. Economic dependence increased pressure. Temples relied on offerings, donations, and ritual fees. With women's labor central to institutional wealth and influence, performance excellence could yield slight improvements in conditions, while fatigue or mistakes risked punishment or extra labor. Their labor was inseparable from temple prosperity, merging sacred service with economic necessity. Seniority brought limited advantages. Experienced priestesses could mentor younger recruits, assign duties, and supervise minor rituals. Temporary exemptions or slightly improved living quarters were possible, yet ultimate authority remained with the temple hierarchy. Even leadership roles came with constraints, as ritual expectations and institutional priorities dominated life. Autonomy was always conditional and limited. Life beyond the temple remained difficult. Former temple prostitutes faced social stigma, restricted employment, and challenges in marriage or family life. Years of ritual labor and sacred service complicated Within the temple, women were revered as sacred instruments. Outside, they were often judged and marginalized. This paradox shaped identity, social perception, and long-term prospects, reinforcing dependence on the institution. Coping strategies were vital. Emotional detachment, careful observation, and strategic alliances allowed women to endure constant scrutiny and labor. Mentorship offered guidance, minor relief, and temporary advantages, yet ultimate authority rested with the institution, limiting personal freedom. Daily existence required endurance, compliance, and psychological resilience to navigate intertwined spiritual, social, and economic demands. In conclusion, temple prostitution in Mesopotamia demanded survival skills, endurance, and adaptability. Sacred service, ritual obligation, hierarchy, and economic necessity governed every aspect of daily life. Women were simultaneously honored as instruments of divine will and exploited as laborers, navigating a system that merged reverence, control, and survival into a lifelong, paradoxical existence. By the final years of temple service, Life had become a rhythm of endurance, compliance, and subtle strategy. Each day began before sunrise, with ablutions, ceremonial dressing, chanting, dancing, and ritual sexual duties. Every gesture, movement, and word was observed and evaluated. Mistakes could result in punishment, additional labor, or loss of privileges. The temple's magnificence, the towering ziggurats, golden altars, and intricate carvings impressed outsiders. But for women living inside, it symbolized hierarchy, restriction, and confinement. Magnificence existed alongside unyielding oversight, shaping daily life in a relentless cycle. Psychological strain remained constant. Women navigated complex hierarchies, monitored their own behavior, and maintained strict emotional control. Missteps could lead to punishment, social disfavor, or extra duties. Friendships and mentorships provided temporary relief, but trust was fragile, often undermined by favoritism, rivalry, or jealousy. Survival demanded careful observation, strategic thinking, and emotional detachment. Compartmentalization became essential, allowing women to separate personal feelings from demanding ritual work and constant scrutiny. Physical labor remained exhausting. Ritual sexual duties, framed as sacred service, were repetitive and physically demanding. Women often engaged with multiple visitors per day, requiring stamina, precision, and detachment. Sacred framing lent legitimacy, but did not reduce fatigue, monotony, or psychological burden. Success and performance influenced privileges, status, and minor comforts, leaving little room for personal choice or autonomy. Education reinforced both spiritual and institutional control. Women mastered hymns, ceremonial dances, mythological recitations, and correct handling of sacred objects. Skill provided minor recognition and slight advantages, but primarily ensured obedience and ritual efficiency. Individual creativity or deviation was discouraged. Mistakes could result in punishment or loss of status. Knowledge served both as spiritual guidance and a mechanism of institutional authority, shaping behavior while maintaining compliance. Interactions with visitors carried significant social and strategic weight. Worshippers, city officials, and merchants could influence daily routines, privileges, and reputation. Positive interactions might improve comfort or recognition, while errors risked punishment or added labor. Women learned to navigate these interactions carefully, balancing obedience, ritual skill, and subtle negotiation. Their bodies and actions were simultaneously sacred instruments, social symbols, and economic contributions, constantly evaluated within the temple system. Economic dependence compounded stress. Temples relied on offerings, donations, and ritual fees, with women's labor integral to institutional wealth and influence. Excellence could improve minor conditions or status, while fatigue or mistakes could bring punishment or extra work. Labor was inseparable from temple prosperity, merging sacred duty with economic necessity. Seniority offered minor autonomy, but never true freedom. Experienced priestesses could mentor recruits, assign tasks, and supervise minor ceremonies. Temporary privileges or improved quarters were possible, yet ultimate control remained with the temple hierarchy. Even leadership roles came with constraints, as ritual rules and institutional priorities dictated daily life. Autonomy was conditional, tied to obedience and compliance. Life outside the temple remained challenging. Former temple prostitutes faced social stigma, restricted opportunities, and difficulty forming families. Years of ritual labor and sacred service complicated Within the temple, women were honored as sacred instruments. Outside, they were often judged and marginalized. This paradox shaped identity, social perception, and long-term prospects, reinforcing dependence on the institution. Coping strategies were essential. Emotional detachment, careful observation, and strategic alliances allowed women to survive constant scrutiny and labor. Mentorship offered guidance, support, and minor advantages. Yet ultimate authority remained institutional, limiting personal freedom. Life required endurance, compliance, and psychological resilience to navigate intertwined spiritual, social, and economic demands. Ultimately, temple prostitution in Mesopotamia demanded lifelong endurance, strategic compliance, and adaptability. Sacred service, ritual obligation, hierarchy, and economic necessity governed every aspect of daily life. Women were simultaneously honored as instruments of divine will and exploited as laborers, navigating a system that merged reverence, control, and survival into a complex, paradoxical, and lifelong experience. Their existence reflected the intricate entanglement of devotion, labor, hierarchy, and survival, leaving a legacy of endurance that defined decades of their lives and shaped the social, spiritual, and economic fabric of Mesopotamian temple society.